Whoa.
That's it, buddy. You're out of here. That's enough, Bella. Move that cookie. Oh, look, it isn't Mr. Peanut again. Out you go.
Years later, 6 hours, a few inches later, day 3, day 4, a few moments later, 1 10 minutes later, 3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m., 3 weeks later, many months later.
Suddenly, the ordinary men are tired of waiting, and they had to hire a new one.
Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight, 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later.
Can you move along? I'm all out of time cards.
Meanwhile, 2 hours later, 8:01 p.m. the next day, later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several times later, 6 hours later,
Time to go, Gabby Goose.
2 hours later, 36 weeks later, 1 minute, 37 seconds later, 1 debt to society later, 1 pair of pants later, 8 hours later, 298,000 happy later, 2 hours later, epilogue, the next day, meanwhile, at the years later, 1 week later, 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later, the following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, much later, 7 hours later, epilogue, several something hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later, yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 3 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day, meanwhile, later, just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage. Back in the lowlands, 1 frozen wasteland later, 1 hour later, 5 hours later, in the void. Approximately 10 hours later, early the next morning, 1 shift later, 2 weeks later, 11 minutes later, 5 minutes later, a lot of boring math later, 24 hours later, 1 week later, 1 long angry line later, 72 hours later, 2 hours later, just then, by sheer coincidence, the next morning, montage, the next morning, many TikToks later, flashback, and a flashback, the very next evening, 1 hour later, the next day, later.